Hey guys, welcome to my channel. In this video, I'll be attempting to DIY a nightstand. Here are some inspo pics I have that show what I'm going for. I started off by using my miter saw to cut down my 2x2 and my 3/4 of an inch by 2 solid red oak boards down to the dimensions I needed. I cut 4 2x2s to 12 inches, 4 2x2s at 9 inches, and then 4 3/4 of an inch by 2 at 14 inches. For the top and the side of my nightstand, I cut down 1/2 inch by 2 feet by 4 feet plywood that has a red oak veneer, and then I used my circular saw and had it attached to my Kreg Rip-Cut saw guide to get accurate cuts. When cutting the plywood, I used tape along where my cut would be just to prevent any peeling up because the layer of veneer is very thin, and then the side that would be visible to people is the side that I had laying face down. After I had my pieces cut down and sanded, I used my Kreg pocket hole jig to create 2 pocket holes on each side of the 2x2s that would be the ones going horizontal, and then I did the same thing for the pieces that would be in the front and the back of my nightstand as well. I originally set my pocket hole jig to 1.5 since that was the width of my 2x2s, and then I drilled holes. However, I could not find 2-inch pocket hole screws that were fine thread, which is what you need when you're using oak, which is a hardwood. And then Kreg only sells the 2-inch and a coarse thread. So I went on their website to figure out if that was the case, and other people had the same problem. And Kreg customer service actually responded saying that you can use 2-inch coarse thread screws, but you would have to drill in and out, or I could set my jig at 3/4 of an inch and then use 1.5 inch fine thread pocket hole screws. I tried both ways and I thought that setting my jig at 3/4 of an inch was easier, so that's what I went with. Lastly, for the faces of the sides and the back of my nightstand, which I was using the 1/2 inch plywood, I set my jig to just 1/2 inch and then just did 2 pocket holes on the left and the right side of the 2 side pieces, and then for the back piece I did 2 pocket holes on the left and the right, and I also did 2 pocket holes on the top and the bottom as well. I started off by assembling the left and right side pieces of my nightstand. For the side, I used my corner clamp to make sure everything was square, and then used 1.5 inch fine thread pocket hole screws to connect the top horizontal 2x2 to the vertical 2x2 boards. Before adding the bottom horizontal piece, I placed 3/8 of an inch thick wood down before adding the 1/2 inch plywood, so that the 1/2 inch plywood would be attached 3/8 of an inch in from the edge of the 2x2. And instead of using 3/8 of an inch thick wood, you can also just use 1/4 of an inch, which would make installing the drawer slides easier later on, which I'll talk about then. Once the shims were in place, I placed my 1/2 inch board on top and then used clamps to keep everything together. I then used 1.5 inch pocket hole screws to connect the 1/2 inch plywood to the vertical 2x2 boards. And then once the plywood was secured to the 2 vertical 2x2s, I then placed the bottom horizontal 2x2 and used my clamps to get rid of any gaps and to make sure everything was square, and then I used the 1.5 inch screws to screw the bottom horizontal board to the vertical 2x2 boards. I repeated the same step for the other side of the nightstand as well. When assembling the back of the nightstand, I just attached the 1/2 inch plywood to the 3/4 of an inch by 2 horizontal boards at the top and the bottom. After I had my side and back pieces built, I started to put the pieces together. I lined up the left side of my nightstand with the back and clamped and made sure it was square before attaching the pieces together with 1.5-inch pocket hole screws. I just repeated everything on the other side as well, and then this is just how it looks like so far. To attach the 3/4 inch by 2-inch boards for the front, top, and bottom, I used wood glue first and clamped everything in place, and then once it was dry, I then went back and added 1.5-inch pocket hole screws. I was initially having trouble with my board shifting when trying to screw my nails in first because I couldn't use my clamp because it was like blocking the pocket hole. So instead I used the glue first, let it dry, and then went back with my pocket hole screws, and it worked fine. So after I glued and clamped the bottom, I left it like that for a couple of hours, and then I took it apart and added screws, and I'm just doing the same thing for the top as well. And then for the bottom, I also decided to add blocks in each 4 corners just to add some extra surface area support for the legs that I'll be attaching. After the frame of the nightstand was complete, I started making the drawers. I opted to use the remaining 1/2-inch plywood to make 2 drawer boxes. I cut the plywood down to the dimensions that I needed, so my side pieces were 3.5 inches tall by 9 inches long, and then my front and back were 3.5 inches tall by 13 inches long, and the base was 13 inches by 10 inches. For the boards that would be in the front and the back, I added 2 pocket holes on the left and the right side of each of those boards, and then for the base board, I did 2 pocket holes per each side for a total of 8. If you want, instead of adding pocket holes to the base, you can also just attach it using a nail gun. Just make sure you take into account the height difference it will make. So in the front, I realized that it won't go in deep enough because this is only 1/2 inch thick. And at first I thought I was doing something wrong, but I looked online, they said it will always stick out if the thickness is 1/2 inch or less. So instead I'm going to take these out, and I'm just going to use my nail gun and create nail holes like I did on this side. And I'll just do it the same on the front. I'll leave the back ones in because it doesn't matter. For the top of the drawers, to cover up like the plywood stripes that it creates, I'm just ironing on Red Oak edge banding just to give it a cleaner look. Before moving on to stain, I decided to test out drawer slides since I've never used them before. So to attach the drawer slides, I just followed the directions and set them back far enough to accommodate for my 1/2-inch drawer fronts. And then the drawer slides needed a surface to rest on, so I used scrap 1/2-inch plywood plus a scrap 1/8 of an inch plywood I had, and then glued those together because I needed it to be flush with my 2x2. Earlier I mentioned that if you use 1/4 inch spacers instead of the 3/8 of an inch that I used, you would then be left with a 3/4 gap that you could then use leftover 3/4 by 2 boards. But since I used the 3/8 spacers, I had to accommodate by gluing the two together. For those scrap boards, I then added wood glue and then clamped them to the inside side of the nightstand. And then once it was dried, I then took the drawer slides, made sure they were level, and then screwed them in. So right here, I just used the other part of the drawer slide and attached it to the back of my drawer boxes. And then once that was done, I just made sure everything fit and was opening and closing well. To prep my nightstand for the stain, I just went in with a pre-stained wood conditioner, and it's oil-based. With gel stains, you don't necessarily have to use a pre-stain, but I just wanted to. The directions for the pre-stain want you to put the stain on within 2 hours of applying the pre-stain. So after about 20 minutes, I went ahead and put my first coat of the Varathane in dark walnut. So I have this stained, but I don't like how the corners are like very sharp. So I tested it out on a piece of extra wood I had, and I just want to create like a small curve. I know I should have done this before I stained, but I'm just going to do it right now. So I'll show you that process using my router. So this is how it looks after 2 coats. I'm just going to go ahead and add one more coat around the outside, and just so I can cover up these rounded edges I just did. But it looks good so far. I kind of just want this to be slightly darker if we can get it. But it looks good so far. While I was waiting for the first coat of stain to dry on like the frame and the drawers of my nightstand, I went ahead and started cutting out pieces for the drawer fronts. I used 1/2 inch solid red oak hardwood for the drawer fronts, and then I just sanded everything down and went in with the pre-stain and stained for that as well. After the stain had dried, I went in with a polyacrylic top coat in a satin finish, and I did 2 coats and waited 2 hours in between each coat. After a couple of days of letting the stain dry, I went ahead and re-put back on the drawer slides onto the boxes, and then just made sure everything fit. When I made the cuts for my drawer fronts, I made them 1/8 of an inch shorter so that when they went into the frame, they would be 1/16 gap on each side of the front. And then I just used Uno cards to make sure everything was evenly placed, and then drilled 2 screws into the back. For my legs, I was originally going to use these leg mounting plates, and then which came with rods, a thread, and then like the base plate. But then when I started to follow the directions and tested it out on a spare piece of 2x2, so when I drilled the 1/2 inch hole and then applied the thread, it was like a loose fit. And then it recommends then using a wrench to like keep it in place. But even after I would like use the wrench and then added my rod, it would just slide right back out. So then I decided to test it out using a 3/8 of an inch hole, but then I ran into the problem where initially it didn't fit. So I was like, okay, maybe by twisting it would then fit. But since it's a hardwood, these grips that are supposed to dig into the wood, which work with softwoods, it would grip in, but with a hardwood it doesn't, so that didn't work either. So I just decided to go a whole different route, which ended up working, and the legs seem stable, but I'll see how they hold up over time. So instead I decided to pre-drill a small hole through a scrap piece of 1/4 inch hardwood and the nightstand leg. I created a dent using a larger drill, but in reverse, so that when I drove the 4-inch screw through the scrap wood and nightstand leg, the screw would be flush with the wood. I then attached the wood scrap / nightstand leg structure to the nightstand by pre-drilling and then screwing 4 1-inch nails into each corner of the scrap wood. So I went ahead off camera and cut out my piece for my top. I went ahead and just curved around the edges and stained it as well. And I'm just going to attach it to my nightstand. So I just have my nightstand flipped over. I made sure when I cut out my top, I made it 1 inch longer widthwise and lengthwise so that I would have a 1/2 inch overhang all the way around. So that's how that looks right now. And then if you remember, for our our front pieces that were in the front and the back, I had screws that went upwards, like as you can see here. I'm going to use 1-inch screws so I can attach the top piece to the structure. Also, I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but I actually got my legs off of an old chair and I just cut them down to the length I needed. But if you need to find like turned legs, there are plenty of different options available on Etsy. So I just used some painter's tape and had it centered where I needed it to be, and then just pre-drilled some holes. And then I took it off and then applied my hardware, and then I just used the same piece of tape for my other drawer so they would pretty much be in the same spot. Once I had the hardware on, I put the drawers back in place and the project was complete. So in total, I spent just over $140, and that was mainly for the wood, the stain, and the drawer slides. This cost will vary based on the size of your nightstand and the type of wood you end up using. Furthermore, I repurposed the legs off an old chair and found some hardware for cheap at the local antique store. Also, I had the tools already and screws from previous projects. Overall, I found this project to be doable, and the hardest part for me was attaching the legs. I worked on it for an hour or two each day, so completed it over a week. This project could definitely be done in a weekend though if you spend more time on it each day.